Greetings and welcome to the Philosopher's Corner. Today I'd like to discuss some issues related to a couple of videos that Professor Anton asked me to watch. The first one is uh, Magical Thinking by P.W. Swivel, I believe, and the second video was actually Professor Anton's response to Swivel's video. Swivel's video was concerned with the distinction between magical thinking and rational thinking, as he set it up, where magical thinking in general is kind of a belief in ghosts and the afterlife and um, uh, spirits in general, things like that, but also in particular certain magical ideas of how the world works. Uh, as Professor Anton explained it, most of these ideas come from the anthropologist uh, Fraser, J.G. Fraser, who I believe came up with the phrase sympathetic magic, implying that what was going on here was at least the belief in feelings or sympathies, or maybe even situations. Pathos actually means to undergo something in a sense, to suffer. Um, so, sympathetic magic basically says that there are the same types of experiences in different parts of the world, and because of that, those different parts of the world can communicate. In particular, there are two main types of sympathetic magic. Um, there's a magic by means of contact, where if you have something that used to be in contact with someone, you can affect them, or if you contact something that has, I mean, physically touch, something that has a certain amount of power, then you can obtain some of that power. And the other type of, second type of magic that Fraser saw in general was a magic in which things imitate other parts or are similar, as Professor Anton explained it. Some things are similar to other things, and so there's a relationship to them. Basically, the first type of magic through physical contact is called contagious magic, not because you can catch it from somebody, as we say today, but because it requires physical contact, physical connection. Then the second type of magic is known as homeopathic. Fraser called it, but also imitative magic, because of the similarity of two things where one can be an image, can imitate the other thing. Um, in imitative magic, for example, an example would be a voodoo doll. I think Professor Anton mentioned a tiki doll, but a voodoo doll will serve the same purpose. Basically, if I want to affect you, I make a voodoo doll that appears like you. In other words, it has a similar appearance to you because you are analogous to each other in that sense. Then when I affect the voodoo doll, that affects you as well. If I destroy the voodoo doll, eventually you will die. With respect to contact magic or magic of contagion, again, if I can get something that was a part of you, so for instance, if I can get some of your hair or your fingernail clippings, or traditional items as well, if I can get some of your hair, and then I destroy the hair because it was in contact with you, it still bears a connection with you, and so I destroy you as I destroy your hair. Now, of course, if I put the hair on the voodoo doll, that's combining both of those types of magic. Uh, Now, what I think is important here um, is one of the things that Professor Anton pointed out is that rather than critiquing or criticizing this way of thinking, what if we really want to resolve the situation, we have to understand how people come to think like this to begin with. And in this respect, Professor Anton mentioned metaphor and metonymy, or as I prefer, analogy and metonymy. Uh, Analogy and metonymy are what I take to be two classes of figures of speech. So, for instance, personification, metaphor itself, and simile are all forms of analogy or comparison, and they're figures of speech that rely on that type of comparison. And metonymy, the example that Professor Anton provided was the notion of synecdoche, which is a type of metonymy, which literally means apart for the whole. But there are other types of metonymy as well, figures of speech that rely on a physical connection, just as in contagious magic, for instance, but are not necessarily part for the whole. So, for instance, if I say to you, I own a Picasso, you're not going to think that I own one of Picasso's children. You're going to know automatically that what I mean is I own a painting by Picasso. Now, I wish I could say that truly. I can't. But if I did say it, you would know what I mean. And so there I'm using the producer for the product. I'm using the name of Picasso, the painter, to say that I have one of his paintings. And that's another form of metonymy. And so analogy and metonymy, as I prefer, because again, metaphor is a type of analogy. The example I like to use is the notion, or the example in a poem by Alfred Tennyson entitled Ulysses, in which Ulysses is thinking about how great his adventures were when he was young. And now he's an old man sitting in his kingdom. He's tired of that. He's going to go out and have another adventure. And he says, come on, guys, let's go get in the boats, take our oars, and as they say, smite the sounding furrows, by which they mean smack the waves with their oars, where furrows is the metaphor because a wave or a set of waves has a shape similar to a set of furrows on land. So the furrow is to the land as the wave is to the water. And clearly that is an analogy, not just a mere comparison. And so metaphors are analogies. As a matter of fact, they're in a sense implicit analogies as compared to similes, which are explicit analogies. They explicitly use the comparisons like or as or things like that. Now, Fraser actually connects these two types of figures of speech with the emergence of the two types of magic, because he understands that those ideas are related. But I think Fraser's ultimate source seems to be from his language. David Hume's text on how we associate ideas. Fraser even eventually, in I think later editions of the Golden Bough, mentions the association of ideas. And what Hume says there, of course, is that we associate ideas. This is the old way of thinking. Before we knew that the brain can connect ideas by neural pathways, the soul had to connect ideas by other means. And of course, one was by contiguity, as David Hume said, when one idea is related in some physical relationship as part to whole, or producer and product and cause and effect for another object. And the second way then that we associate ideas is resemblance, where of course when two ideas are similar, you think of one idea that may cause you to think of a similar idea. And then the third way that Hume said we associate ideas is by causality. But then he goes on to say later in the text that causality is a form, in a sense, of advanced contiguity, or contiguity underlies causality. So in a sense, causality is another aspect of contiguity. That reduces Hume's three ways of associating ideas to two: contiguity and resemblance. Excuse me. Eventually, in the 1860s and the final decades of the 19th century, Charles Sanders Peirce takes those ideas and sees them in the situation that we now call semiotics or semiosis, the reading of signs by intelligent creatures. There are two basic types of signs, according to Peirce: indexes and icons, and then eventually human beings create symbols. But if we look at what the indexes and icons are based on, we're going to find familiar ideas, because what Peirce says is that indexes are signs that point to what they point to because there was some physical connection. And so, for instance, a track in the dirt made by an animal's paw is an index. It indicates that that animal's paw was there at some previous time. Or a spray of scent put on a tree by a cat or a bear, maybe rubbing its back against the tree. That was a physical part of the animal. Now it's left in the environment and can be read as a sign to indicate that that animal was there. Those types of signs are called indexes. And the type of relationship that connects the index to what it points to is that physical connection that we call contiguity. The second type of basic sign is the icon, from a word that means an image in Greek. And icons are signs that refer to what they refer to because they have a resemblance. Typically, we think of a visual resemblance. So if the paw print actually has the shape of the paw pad that created it, it will not only be an index indicating that the animal was there, but it could be used to identify the animal if we know the shape of the animal's paw pad and can recognize that in the image of the print itself. Excuse me. And so the type of relationship that underlies the icons, of course, is that relationship of resemblance, or as we prefer these days, isomorphism. Isomorphism is a relationship between entities that preserve certain types of ordering, certain types of relationships. And so, again, the basic ideas under indexes and icons, the basic science, are contiguity and isomorphism. Um, and the reason I want to stress all this is because I believe that contiguity ultimately is what is perceived as the structure of time, and isomorphism is what is perceived as the structure of space. There's a basic isomorphism to the universe, if you want to put it that way, that we experience as space, and a basic contiguity. Now, granted, space is contiguous itself because any 2 points are next to each other. Of course, once we start thinking about continuous space and whether space is actually the continuum, that does lead to problems of contiguity in the sense of two things being right next to each other, because in a continuous space, between any 2 points, no matter how close they are, there are always an infinite number of points. And so no matter what points you pick to get closer, there's always going to be an infinite number of points in between. But if we think of space merely as a set of even dense points, we can think of space as being contiguous, where one piece of space is next to the left of, to the right of, whatever, another part of space. But what is really defining about space is its isomorphism, the fact that one part of space is perfectly identical to another part of space. With respect to time, time is contiguous as space is. One moment follows after another, but it certainly is not isomorphic on a largest scale. Otherwise, there would be no difference between the future and the past, or between one moment and the next, as there is no difference between one piece of space and the next. And so isomorphism is what our nervous system perceives as space. Contiguity is what our nervous system perceives as time. And as if you look at the evolution of the nervous system over the past 500 million years, what you see is that as it becomes more and more complex, eventually it splits into two. We have what are called the bilateral hemispheres, and in human beings, and perhaps in some other animals, they're actually what we call asymmetric. They're not the same on both sides. Ironically, or interestingly, I guess, if you look at the characteristics given by the developmental psychologists to the two sides of the brain, we find ideas like, for instance, on the left hand, which is usually the dominant side, we have language, it's linguistics, it's serial, it's one thing after another, there's time involved, it's analytical, it tears things apart, and divergent. Whereas with the other side of the brain, the right-hand side of the brain, it's intuitive in terms of perceptual experience, in a sense, rather than linguistics. It looks at perceptual wholes. It has time involved there. There's the notion of I'm sorry, it's atemporal. The linguistic side is the temporal side, and the emotional right-hand side of the brain is the atemporal side that basically is a process of comparing complete forms and parts of forms and stuff like that. And so basically we find ideas on one side of the brain that are connected with the definition of contiguity. We find ideas on the other side of the brain that are connected with the ideas of isomorphism, of comparing similarities. And so my belief is that the reason that people start believing in magical processes is because it's pretty much basically the way the brain works. The brain works by uh, accommodating contiguity and isomorphism in terms of causality and classes of things, and all kinds of things. And so uh, once we start to express ourselves in language, and of course you have to remember that this is at a time when we know absolutely nothing about how the world works except how to keep ourselves alive, pretty much. And so once we start expressing ourselves, we not only express ourselves in terms of the only thing we know, human personality, and we project that and personify the world and all the things in the world, but we also do so in terms of, in large part, contiguity and isomorphism. I mean, if we look at the earliest myths, for instance, what we find are two important types of myths. Myths of how the world comes into existence, which is sort of temporal and contiguous process, but eventually ends up with these specific forms almost all over the world. As a matter of fact, the basic form of the world is a circular island with islands in each of the four directions, and colors and all that kind of stuff. Um, and then the other set of myths are the origin of people, in terms of descent, again, contiguity, the passage of time, one thing following after another, but also in the structure of our clans, our classes, who we're related to in terms of similarities. And so we have all of these things going on with us in a brain that is wired to look for those things specifically. So when language comes out of our mouths, not only is it richly figurative in the beginning, it's so with a stress on the figures of types of analogy and types of metonymy. And so naturally, the idea of contagious magic, which is in a sense a sort of belief that your metonymic figures of speech are talking about physical situations, and imitative magic, which is a belief that your analogical figures of speech are talking about some type of physical connection. We convince ourselves that what we believe about the world is what's really out there. And so we develop all of these ideas based on those fundamental beliefs, which are uh, uh, much in the form, again, of metaphor and analogy. I'm sorry, metonymy and analogy based on contiguity and isomorphism. And now, before I finish, I do want to finish here quickly. I don't want to go on too much. This is actually a little trying for me to sit in front of a camera and do this. But anyway, would like to point out that contiguity and isomorphism are not just ideas in our heads. As I said, I think contiguity gives us the structure of time, and isomorphism gives us the structure of space. But space-time itself is also known as the gravitational field, in which we, of course, live and move and have our being. And because it permeates all of our existence from the very beginning, we are, in a sense, extremely familiar with it. However, we can get to understand it better, and the first step towards that basically is starting to understand contiguity and isomorphism. We can see this in terms of the basic types of machines. Often in school, what they say are there are 5 basic machines. Let me think if I can remember them all. There's the inclined plane, and then there's the lever, and then there's the screw, which is an inclined plane wrapped around a cone, and then there's the wheel, right? And finally there's the pulley, which is basically a wheel with a rope thrown over it. That's the standard spiel, but actually that's a misunderstanding, because really there is only one object we're concerned with, and that is the inclined plane, and it comes in 2 basic forms, the fixed and the movable. If we think of a standard inclined plane, basically what it does is connect 2 parts of space. If, for instance, if there's something up here that I want on a cliff and I'm down here and I'm not tall enough to get that, I can lay an inclined plane from point A to point B, if you will, and then walk up it, because now those 2 points are contiguous in a way that they were not contiguous before. And so the inclined plane allows me to deal with contiguity. The second type of inclined plane, the movable, is of course the lever, where we put an inclined plane and we balance it on a fulcrum. Um, and we can see that basically if the 2 arms of the lever are equal and the 2 weights are equal on both sides, then the lever will be balanced. But we can also balance it if we make a particular ratio between the distance of one side and the weight of the second side, and the distance of the second side and the weight on the first side. If we have the correct ratio there, in other words, if their ratios are proportional, the inclined plane, the lever will be balanced as well. And so clearly the lever allows us to study different types of equilibrium, a form of isomorphism. And so just as a final note, I want to say that contiguity and isomorphism, as far as I can tell, are the fabric of space-time itself, as our nervous system has evolved over the past 500 million years. It seems to me that it has done so in a way that accommodates that medium of space-time, if you will. Therefore, when we start projecting our thoughts about reality, and in a sense bringing that inner space that Professor Anton was talking about and projecting it out, to me it's not surprising that it comes in the terms of magical thinking. Also because, of course, looking at the world symbolically, or in other words, looking at the world as if it were a set of signs that we're supposed to read, is one of the most natural things for the human brain and for pretty much any brain to do. That's what brains do. They read signs in the environment and try to, maybe not always intentionally, but or consciously, but they do read signs in the environment and make adjustments to accommodate what they think those signs mean. And of course, if they're successful, they tend to survive. If they're not, they tend to die out. And so clearly, I think that the fact that, I should say, my belief that contiguity and isomorphism are woven into the brain should give us a evolutionary advantage. And when you consider that all of the products of technology are basically the products of ultimately of our rational thinking, then I think that bears witness. Finally, I do want to say something about the distinction between rational thinking and magical thinking. In the magical thinking video, a lot of stress was placed on emotions, and one of the thrusts of the ideas there was that we should eliminate emotional and magical thinking and be totally rational. Of course, if we did that, we would end up with a planet of Dr. Spock's, or I'm sorry, Mr. Spock's. I forgot my Star Trek there for a while. We might as well be living on Vulcan. Clearly, emotion is important to human beings, and I don't think we're ever going to be able to eliminate it. What we need to do is educate people at an early age about rational thinking so that they can take advantage of that type of thinking when they become mature adults. Anyway, that's my take on it. You can take it for what it's worth. I do appreciate you watching. Thank you.